Welcome back, everyone, to my online course for research methods in psychology. As I've mentioned before, my name is Frank Loschiavo, and I'm your instructor. We have several interesting topics to discuss, so let's get started. Most of us wear many hats, so we can define ourselves many different ways. Psychologists are the same way. Of course, some psychologists conduct therapy sessions with clients. Some teach. Some spend the majority of their time conducting research. In this video, and throughout most of this course, we're going to focus on them. They are scientists. I typically refer to these scientists as research psychologists for relatively obvious reasons. They are psychologists who specialize in conducting scientific research. In this video, I'll discuss a few ways in which research psychologists approach their work. In other words, I'll briefly and very generally discuss how they think and what they do. For example, most psychologists are empiricists, and research psychologists are no exception. So let's get to work and discuss that particular characteristic first. Psychology is what we call an empirical science. That simply means what we discover about human thought and behavior, what we come to know about human thought and behavior, is based on verifiable observations and measurements. So the science of psychology, just like the science of biology or physics, is based on much more than a researcher's opinions and intuitions. The science of psychology is based on systematic observations and measurements. That's a good thing, and that's what an empirical science is all about. Systematic observations and measurements that can be verified by other scientists. So that means we typically describe research psychologists as empiricists. And again, that's a good thing. Although there might be some psychologists out there masquerading as research scientists, discussing their opinions as though those opinions were facts, credible research psychologists are making discoveries about human thought and behavior based on systematically observing human behaviors we can see, based on systematically listening to human voices we can hear, and based on instruments that allow us to tap into thoughts and behaviors that might not be so easily accessible. For example, let's consider again the classic research of Stanley Milgram. Remember, he wanted to see if ordinary people would be obedient to an authority figure who ordered them to harm another ordinary, innocent person. So he devised a laboratory situation where one of his assistants, who he called a learner, was strapped to a chair and hooked up to a shock generator. Then he trained a research subject, who he called a teacher, to teach that person word pairs, simply pairs of words. When the learner remembered word pairs incorrectly, the teacher was instructed to shock the learner, and over time the shocks grew to dangerous, potentially lethal levels. Of course, the learner never received any actual shocks, but the teacher didn't know that. Throughout the experiment, across many different research subjects, Milgram was able to systematically observe and measure the teacher's behavior. For example, Milgram measured how much shock the teacher delivered. He measured how quickly the teacher delivered the shock. He measured how long the teacher pressed the shock levers. And, as you might recall, Milgram learned that most teachers obeyed the experimenter throughout the entire experiment. In other words, he discovered that ordinary people would deliver potentially lethal shocks if an authority figure ordered them to do so. Milgram's use of systematic observation and measurement was a good example of empirical research. For reasons we'll discuss at another time, Milgram's study was extremely controversial, but it was a great empirical research study nonetheless. Milgram's research wasn't conducted on a whim. Milgram witnessed the atrocities of World War II, and he wondered how ordinary people could be involved in such horrific crimes against humanity. To help make sense of it, he devised a theory, and part of that theory stated that people lose their independence when under the control of an authority figure. In place of their own independence, they become agents of the authority figure. At that point, they may no longer feel personally responsible for their actions because they're just doing what they were told to do. That's not great logic, but it's an interesting theory, and parts of it can be tested. So, Milgram asked a research question: will ordinary people harm others when an authority figure demands that they do so? Then, as you know by now, he designed a research study to test some specific hypotheses. A hypothesis is just a prediction. Milgram asked a variety of psychologists what they thought would happen in the research study he planned to conduct. Most predicted that very few people would be obedient. In other words, most psychologists he asked hypothesized that very few people would deliver dangerous shocks to an innocent person. Regardless of your specific predictions, in today's world of research, it's wise to pre-register your hypotheses before collecting data. And nowadays, there are a variety of ways to do that online. Pre-registering your predictions before collecting data buys you some credibility, so that later on, when you find that more than half your research subjects were willing to deliver lethal shocks, you can confidently state, "That's exactly what I thought would happen," assuming that is, indeed, what you predicted before collecting the data. Pre-registering also provides an opportunity to share your data analysis plan. So in addition to stating your predictions, you can also tell the world exactly how you plan to conduct your statistical analyses. Because there are so many ways to analyze data, it's wise to develop a plan, pre-register that plan, and then stick to that plan. That's how you establish credibility in the scientific community. There's lots of room for monkey business when analyzing data, but pre-registering a data plan puts a stop to almost all of it. Once you've developed a theory and generated hypotheses, it's time to collect some data. In other words, it's time to observe your research subjects in action. That's the fun part, but it can be really hard and time-consuming as well. Just think of how complex Milgram's research was, and he had to run each subject in person one at a time. I'm telling you, my friends, conducting good research often is not easy. It might be easy to administer a brief survey over the internet, but a complex laboratory experiment is likely to tell us much more about human thought and behavior. As you know, when Milgram analyzed his data, he found evidence that supported his theory on obedience to authority. Specifically, he found that most of his research subjects were willing to administer lethal shocks to innocent people. And through follow-up interviews, he discovered why they were willing to carry out such destructive orders. His research subjects typically mentioned that they didn't want to hurt the learner, but that they trusted the experimenter, the person giving them the orders to deliver the shocks. They figured the experimenter wouldn't ask someone to shock someone if it wasn't safe. And they figured if something went wrong, it would be the experimenter's responsibility, not their own. That's an amazing discovery. Milgram found that ordinary people would be willing to harm others if they thought the experimenter would be responsible for it. That's scary stuff, my friends. But that's also amazing insight into human thought and behavior. Was Milgram's research on obedience to authority designed to help people in the real world know when they should be and when they should not be obedient? That's what applied research typically focuses on, helping us solve some real-world problem. But in the real world, we're not typically asked to help people learn pairs of words, and we're not typically asked to shock people when they remember word pairs incorrectly. Because Milgram's research was so far removed from what we do in the real world, his research probably shouldn't be classified as applied research. Was Milgram's research on obedience designed without any real-world application in mind? In other words, was Milgram's research designed just to help us add more information to our collective understanding of human thought and behavior? That's what basic research is all about. It's not designed to fix any real-world problems. In general, I think it's possible to categorize Milgram's research as basic, but honestly, I think there's more to it. After all, Milgram designed his research to better understand the atrocities of World War II. There must be some applied focus to it, right? Maybe Milgram's research on obedience is best characterized as translational research. I don't know, because it doesn't fit perfectly within this category either. Translational research typically tests something clearly related to the real world, but often in a more controlled laboratory environment. So, for example, if Milgram taught people the importance of questioning authority, and then tested the effects of that training in a laboratory experiment, then he'd be conducting translational research. But that's not what his original research was all about, so I probably wouldn't categorize his original research as translational either. So, my friends, where does that leave us? Honestly, I think his research lies somewhere between basic research and translational research. That's just my opinion, and not everybody would agree with me, but my point is to help you understand that research is complex. It can't always be forced into one and only one category, and that's fine. In fact, it's probably best to view the line from basic research to applied research as a continuum, with various research studies falling somewhere along that continuum, depending on the topic being studied, the type of research design being used, and the goals of the research program. If my example using Milgram's research confused you, then take a look at this graphic. It provides more straightforward examples of basic, applied, and translational research. If you conducted a really cool research study, wouldn't you want to share the results with other people, other researchers? I would, and most research scientists feel the same way. They're eager to add their research to the collective understanding of human thought and behavior. In other words, they want to add their results to the literature. The literature is what research scientists call the published research in their field. So, for example, Milgram conducted a fascinating study on obedience to authority, and I'm sure he was eager to publish his findings in the social psychological literature. So he summarized his findings in a research report, and he submitted that report, which we sometimes refer to as a manuscript, to the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology. But make sure you understand, journal editors don't publish every manuscript they receive. They need to make sure the research was conducted appropriately, that the data was analyzed correctly, and that the conclusions that the authors made are reasonable based on the data they collected. Journal editors don't make publication decisions on their own. Instead, they send manuscripts out for peer review. So, for example, Milgram's manuscript was probably sent to several expert researchers who specialize in social psychology. As they reviewed Milgram's manuscript, they offered anonymous written comments about how well the study was designed, comments about the nature of the results, and comments about how important the research is given our current understanding of human thought and behavior. Based on those reviews, the journal editor then decided whether or not to publish the article, and of course, Milgram's article was published. Once a journal article is published, the rest of the scientific community can read it. At that point, some researchers might try to replicate the original results, and many researchers will cite the original results when they write journal articles on similar topics. I did a quick Google search on Milgram's original article. You can see that it's been cited thousands of times, and I suspect that's a low estimate. Journal articles are often quite short, so after publishing a series of articles on a single topic, like obedience to authority, some researchers share all their knowledge about that topic in a book. Although journal articles are often very technical and written for other professional researchers, books that focus on academic research topics are typically much more accessible, much easier to read. So they're often great resources for the general public. Speaking of resources for the general public, you should know that not all research articles are published in peer-reviewed journals. For example, I recently published a research article in an online magazine. It didn't go through a peer review process, but it was reviewed by several editors who work for the online magazine. And, of course, researchers try to publicize their work in the mass media and via social media. Here's just one of many examples. These articles are usually written by journalists. There's nothing wrong with that, but articles written for popular media usually cover just a few major points from the original published journal article. So they're great for a quick read, and they're great for worldwide audiences, but they often leave out too much detail. But that's really no big deal, because if you come across a story in the popular media that you find really interesting, you can always look up the original journal article and find all the details that you need. Well, that's it for this section, but stay tuned because I'll have more to say about research methods in the next video.